Let's see. Let's start again. All right. Associated with, because I gave a similar talk to a similar audience in Manchester about 2 or 3 months ago now, and Diane Coyle was part of it was actually a debate, myself, Diane Coyle, and a guy called George Cooper. Anybody heard the name George Cooper before? Interesting book. He's actually a physicist who used to work as a trader for Goldman Sachs and has now become a staunch critic of mainstream economics from the point of view of both a physicist and somebody who actually worked in trading in a major financial institution, and has an interesting book called Blood, Money and Revolution that I do recommend people having a read of for a different approach to economics. But at that talk, and also in the BBC Radio 4 documentary about teaching economics after the crash, Diane Coyle gave her opinion of what was this focus that the Rethinking Economics students have, and also, of course, Kingston has, about teaching schools of thought. And she said that there's this idea of a monolithic neoclassical school, that it needs to switch to a different type, etc., etc. And she reckons that's going backwards to what she said the medieval scholastic debates in the 1930s about what your worldview was. And a student asked her about, without being aware of this quote, I think, asked her about the same sort of issues at Manchester, and she gave a very similar reply, saying finding it quite bizarre. There's a lot of reaching for the 70 or 100-year-old historical ways of thinking about the economy, when the economy has changed so much. I actually quipped at the time that I didn't realise I was any older than 60 when she made the kind of 70 or 100 years old. But it's seeing post-Keynesian as meaning what Keynes was writing about in the 1930s. And that is, pardon me, ignorant of the large part of the history of economic thought. The core curriculum describes itself as being teaching economics as if the last 30 years has happened. But when you take a look at it, it's as if the last 30 years of research in neoclassical economics has happened, not the real world and not rival schools of thought. So let's go back and take a look at those times anyway and see, is there any reason why the 1930s might be an interesting time for us to look at as compared to our current period? Because looking at the level of private debt to GDP, which is one thing that I focus upon, I think I can see a couple of similarities between the 1930s and now. Okay. With us in a worse situation as it happens, once you normalise for different ways of recording private debt over time. And when you see what happened to the economy in the 1930s, there was what looked like a great moderation going on for a while, and then a complete breakdown. The 1930s is the red data. You can see that's the level of unemployment, series of cycles heading down, and I'm sure by the 1930 they thought they hit the great moderation. And then bang, explodes to 25% of the unemployment rate being 25% in the States in that long period of the Great Depression, the 1930s. And you plot the current data on there. Of course, the current unemployment data is nowhere near as bad as the 1930s, but the trends have certain similarities, don't they? And I argue there's a causal argument going on behind that as well, because these are two variables which are supposed to have no correlation according to neoclassical economics. One is the change in debt as a percentage of GDP. That's the red line graphed on the left y-axis, and the blue line is unemployment graphed on the right, turned upside down so you can see the correlation more clearly. And a minus 0.78 correlation over the 20 years of data that I've got there. According to Ben Bernanke, that's supposed to be not significantly different from zero. And this is the current data, minus 0.93 over 25 years. So I think there are reasons why we might see the 1930s and today as similar, and therefore what's going on in economics are having similarities as well. Because, again, this is a crisis which caught the mainstream by surprise. The same thing applied back in the 1930s. And its explanation, there really is no mainstream explanation for the crisis we've been through. But if you look at how they explain the 1930s, this is Ben Bernanke, who got the job as president of the Federal Reserve on the basis that he was or chairman, basis that he was the expert on the Great Depression. And my opinion of him is he's not the expert on the Great Depression. He's an expert on explanations of the Great Depression that are consistent with neoclassical theory. And the only explanation that's consistent with neoclassical theory is, for want of a better phrase, the butler did it. Okay? Capitalism itself can't have crises, therefore it has to be whoever's taking care of the house that lets the system down, and he blames the Federal Reserve. and quotes Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's survey of monetary data, saying there was a huge collapse in monetary supplies, and that can be blamed entirely on the Federal Reserve. And then speaking at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday party, he ended up with this little piece of ad-libbing saying, regarding the Great Depression, you were right, we did it, i.e. the Federal Reserve. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again. Well, I think that in 2002, so I think the best way to subtitle that is whoops. Because he was, of course, in the hot seat when the damn thing hit. Now, if he was the expert, then you would consider the wide range of views on something which was, when it happened in the 1930s, completely unexpected, outside what the mainstream thought could be possible. So how did he consider non-orthodox theories of the Great Depression when he was writing his surveys in the 1980s and 1990s? Well, he read in his book, Essays on the Great Depression, this is his entire reference to the work of Hyman Minsky. This is Minsky and Kindleberger have argued for the inherent instability of the financial system, but in doing so have had to depart from the assumption of rational economic behaviour. Now that's the end of his discussion of Minsky in the text of the book. There's a footnote which adds he doesn't deny the importance of irrationality in economic life, but it seems the best research postulate is to push the rationality postulate as far as it will go. That's as far as he considered Minsky. Now, of course, after the event I mentioned, he pretends he pays more attention to Minsky than he paid beforehand. But what's going on there is ignoring an alternative point of view because it doesn't fit your paradigm. Your paradigm requires what you call rational behaviour. You don't consider somebody else's explanation because it doesn't have what your paradigm contains. And I think the same thing is happening with the core curriculum today. It's still the same neoclassical paradigm. It's leaving out alternative ways of thought, and as Ben was saying in the introduction, we need to have a more democratic approach to economics, not because democracy should rule science in general, but because we don't have science in economics. And it's about time we had a range of views being expressed. And I just remember this expression that went through that experience with Diane Coyle's idea of what was heterodox economics. It reminded me of a phrase from Hamlet, where Horatio is extemporising to Hamlet about something or other, and Hamlet says in exasperation, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." And I think that applies to the economy and neoclassical economics as well. They leave out an enormous part of what is the real world. And you shouldn't, particularly after a crisis like we've been through in the 2007 to now, ignore what you can't explain. And of course that applies very, very heavily to what's going on in Greece right now. So it's not a case that post-Keynesian economics and the other schools of thought in general are 70 to 100-year-old historical ways of thinking. They're lively modern research agendas, varying strengths and varying directions, but they've all been inspired by a similar crisis to what happened today, happening back 80 years ago. And the reason we use Keynes as a point of reference is because the 1930s was the biggest challenge to economics prior to now. And Keynes wrote in the 1930s. You could actually go further back and take a look at people like Veblen to find the earliest mentionings of dissent from the neoclassical mainstream. And there are plenty of other schools of thought. So I could be talking about ecological economics or institutional or Austrian or feminist or Marxist. There's a whole range of different subgroups that are non-orthodox. And the intriguing thing is most people in these schools read neoclassical literature because you have no choice. Okay? That sets the overall framework. And you're also what you get educated in. Most of us have sat in classes like you're sitting in now, studying DSGE models or something like that. And the other direction, neoclassicals don't read non-neoclassical authors, so much so they don't even necessarily know they exist. Well, that's less so after the crisis than before, but very much so the case. You know, when the crisis first occurred, they had no idea of the existence of people apart from Minsky that they'd heard a few mentionings of from conferences and so on. So post-Keynesian economics is part critique, and as they're dating from well before when Keynes first wrote. Probably the earliest substantive critique you can find is Veblen's wonderful 1898 paper, Why is Economics Not an Evolutionary Science? It's just that Keynes made the biggest break. Okay? And Keynes was also somebody who came from the mainstream, was always a public figure, and started shifting towards a critical point of view. The post-Keynesian argument is what Keynes was trying to bring about was derailed by Hicks with the ISLM interpretation of Keynes. Have you all done ISLM, I imagine? A lot of you haven't. Okay, you don't go. You go straight to DSGE these days, do you?
Maybe just more. Some people haven't studied economics. Maybe.
Oh, okay. Well, there's actually a paper by Hicks which was seen as an interpretation of the general theory that neoclassical economists got to understand, called Mr. Keynes and the Classics. It's about a 15-page so-called summary of the general theory. Interesting enough, Keynes wrote his own 15-page summary in the same year, called The General Theory of Employment. Now, if you haven't read Keynes, and a lot of you I mentioned haven't read the general theory, I wouldn't really bother. I think it's a pretty badly written book. It's put me out. A lot of my post-Keynesian friends hate me for saying that, but I think to me it's a bit like looking at a snake when it's halfway, it's like a moth, halfway between being a moth and a butterfly. He's leaving behind the old stuff, taking on the new, but you can really find both versions inside there. This little paper called The General Theory of Employment is succinct and almost entirely original in terms of it's the new type of thought coming out of the general theory. So if you haven't read Keynes, read that one. You can finish it in an hour, and then at the same time, read Hicks, Mr. Keynes and the Classics. And you'll go through the same experience that Hyman Minsky did when he did the same thing himself late in his career, when he used to accept the textbook version of Keynes and then read the General Theory of Employment, and when he first spoke about it, spoke at a conference at the American Economic Association, and said how he couldn't understand how anybody could regard the ISLM model as a summary of Keynes, having read this summary of Keynes by Keynes at that point. Intriguingly, Hicks abandoned that interpretation in 1981. There's another paper by Hicks I also recommend called ISLM, An Explanation, published in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, as it happens. And I actually think it's better titled ISLM, An Apology. So the major points there were saying, first of all, you can't use risk as a proxy for uncertainty. That's one of the major breaking points between the two. And what neoclassical calls rational expectations, if you look at how the term is defined, it's saying people who have a model that can let them accurately predict the future. That's not rational, that's prophetic. And I now refer to that as prophetic expectations when I give talks, but it's nothing to do with rational. And the economy is cyclical and evolutionary. You've got to have a model which is inherently cyclical and where you do it properly, where it evolves and changes in structure and nature over time. So it's never an equilibrium, and that was the point that Hicks reached in ISLM and Explanation. And when you take a look at things like competition, then the focus of competition isn't so much price as the evolution of products. And that sort of work has been done by a lot of evolutionary economists these days. Money, banks and debt are essential. You can't model capitalism without them. And production itself, if you want to do it properly, you've got to look at the multi-sectoral nature of production, the input-output dynamics that exist and that make the economy inherently unstable but also creative. So all these things are parts of what are tied up in post-Keynesian economics in general. And John King does a very good job of giving an overview, as does an earlier book by Jeff Harcourt. So take a look for those if you want to get a broad survey. John has two books, one, A History of Post-Keynesian Economics, which is a chronological treatise written by him only, and then another book which has a number of sections, like a dictionary or an encyclopedia, where a number of people are contributors, including me, for a couple of the chapters there. So there's many alternative strands within that overall system, and you'll find people like, there used to be a strong school in Manchester known as Rethinking Economics, around a guy called Ian Steedman. That's been completely eliminated. I don't think there's anybody left at Manchester who works in that field anymore. Koleskian work, which people like Peter Kreiser in New South Wales University are strong on, looking at the cyclical nature of growth. The stock-flow consistent approach, which dominates a lot of American work, coming out of the work of Wynne Godley, modern monetary theory and so on, and Mark Lavoie in Canada. And the work that I do, which is largely around the work of Hyman Minsky, is we're trying to find a monetary explanation for both cycles and crises. So I'm just one of many non-orthodox economists doing this sort of stuff, and I'm trying to blend all those various approaches together, and also working with the people working in energy theory, because a major thing which is left out of economic theory is the role of energy. It comes down to production functions that are used both by neoclassicals and by post-Keynesians. They assume you can create output with just capital and labour, which you can't. Okay, you can't make anything without the free energy we find in the universe. And that's a major thing we all need to work on to make our work more sensible. So that's the overall picture. My main stuff is at the moment is working on bringing in banks, debt and money into macroeconomics. And an essential issue to cover right now, and my approach here is very much inspired by the modern monetary theory and sectoral balances approach, is what should be done about Greece. How did we let a country get into the situation Greece is now? And by the way, if you get people who tell you that it's all the Greeks' fault, take a look at Spain, because Spain was doing everything right according to the EU before the crisis hit. Okay? Had a debt to GDP ratio, public debt to GDP ratio below 60%. Not only was it running a deficit below 3%, it was actually running a surplus on the government accounts for quite some time. So it was doing all the things right according to the conventional theory, and then it exploded. So if you get people told it's the lazy, irresponsible, etc., Greeks, pull out the Spanish data and say, give me the same argument for Spain, which you can't do. But anyway, the basis for this whole argument that we should be using austerity to cure a downturn like the one Greece is going through comes out of work by Robert Barrow. Now, he's one of the main people who developed the whole rational expectations neoclassical approach, in particular what they call Ricardian equivalence. You've heard that one? Some of you? Okay. And this is the paper where he invented this concept. And he starts from this proposition: a deficit finance cut in taxes leads to higher future taxes. In other words, any reduction in tax now means an increase in tax in the future. So a cut in taxes today must be matched by a corresponding increase in the future. You can't just have taxes going down and not having compensating in the future. That's an assumption, not a fact. Okay. He says, suppose now, this is where you start making assumptions. And as one of my students pointed out sometime, when an economist says, let's assume, what he's really saying is let's pretend. Okay? So let's pretend that households' demand for goods depend upon the expected present value of future taxes. So therefore, if you have a budget deficit now, that will be, because that means taxes drop now but they're going to rise in the future, households save money so that they can pay those future taxes. And he argues that a budget deficit has no impact upon aggregate demand. Equally, therefore, running a budget surplus should also have no impact. Okay? So they wouldn't have expected any downturn in Greece, or a far smaller one than occurred. So a current budget deficit leads to an offsetting increase in private desired savings, and hence no change in desired national saving. Okay? Now, how did he reach that set of fairly strong conclusions? Well, he made a couple of other pretends. He assumed that there's a network, and this is a direct quote, a network of intergenerational transfers makes a typical person part of an extended family that goes on indefinitely. Okay? Punchline, in this setting, households capitalise the entire rate of expected future taxes and therefore plan effectively with an infinite horizon. So that's what your parents are doing when they're working out the budget tonight. You know, planning for the next 55,000 years of your family lineage. Okay? So what he's saying is families plan for an infinite future. So with the deficit increase today, what you therefore do in response to a deficit today is you save so that the future generations will have the money to pay the increased taxes you know they're going to face. And there's only one question I need to ask about this particular argument by Barrow, and that's what the hell was he smoking? Okay? It's just insane that people can make some assumptions like this. And this is one reason when I teach, I get students to go back and read the journal papers, because by the time this crap, and there's no other way to describe it, gets to the textbooks, they've sanitised it so much that it seems halfway reasonable. As you go back and see where it comes from, it's just crap. That sort of assumption to say, forget it, I'm not going to bother listening to your argument any further past that point. So there's delusional reasoning going on there. First of all, you have prophetic agents who can plan for an indefinite future. And in fact, one thing I like about Barrow, again, one of the beauties of the modern times is you can go and find where these people say things that in a later time they wish they hadn't said, but it's in print. And writing in 1984, Barrow had a paper called Rational Expectations in 1984, or some title like that. And he made the comment that one of the cleverest things about the rational expectations revolution was I think he said expropriating, or a word like that, the word rational. Okay? Effectively stealing it from the dictionary, which then meant anybody who opposed it had to be supporting irrationality, which is really hard for them to do. So I'm going to just basically steal the word back and say what you've defined as actually prophetic expectations. So I'm going to call it prophetic expectations from now on. The second part of the delusion is having a non-monetary and equilibrium vision of capitalism. That's the main thing I'll focus upon now. Because if you have a non-monetary vision, then saving has to be putting something physical aside. Okay? It's not something fiat-based. And it's not in a growth system either. Now, both those delusional assumptions can't work. People don't predict the future. They don't plan for the infinite future. They can't predict tomorrow, let alone what's going to happen in 50,000 years. And we have a growing economy which is monetary. So all those various elements of thinking that we see there in Barrow's arguments don't apply in the real world, but they really were the basis for designing the euro the way it was designed. And now for imposing austerity on those countries in the belief that you get a short, sharp downturn followed by rapid revival. If you read the original documents by the EU and the Troika about what the unemployment rate would be in Greece at the absolute depth of the downturn they expected austerity to cause, it was 16% 2 years ago. It's 25% today. Okay? They're that wrong about the impact of their policies on that country. So their policy was for a sustained surplus of 4.5% of GDP. I mean sustained for some substantial period of time, like about 10 years. With the same time, an objective that the nominal rate of growth of the economy would be 3%. Now those two in a monetary system are simply contradictory, and I'll show you why. And it comes out of, having that vision comes out of seeing the government like a business and saying, well, businesses run a surplus. You know, they try to have more revenue coming in than they have money going out, so the government should do the same thing, or the same vision from a household point of view. Well, if you're going to do that, if you're going to have a surplus of that scale, then your taxes have to exceed your government expenditure by that much money, 4.5% per annum. And then the vision is that the economy is going to be profitable, it'll boom, and off you go. And I've got a group of cartoonists working with me producing a cartoon version of Debunking Economics. And Miguel and Susie just published this brilliant cartoon right now. I know you can't quite see the text there, but you can see the ball of debt and the Scythian hill next to it. And Merkel is saying to Janus, it's actually rather a nice likeness of Janus. I've just sent it to him. You're going to take this new debt and use it to pay for your already soul-crushing, insurmountable debt. And when you've got that, haven't got a prayer of ever recovering, bam, that's when prosperity happens. Why can't you see it? It summarises pretty nicely, I think. But let's take a monetary look at what's being suggested by the Troika. Let's divide society into two halves, the government and the private sector. And if you're going to have a surplus, so the government's going to run a surplus, that means its taxes on the private sector have to exceed its spending on the private sector. So there has to be a net flow of money. When we're talking dollars here and pounds or euros, we're not talking goods. Okay, it's a flow of money, not physical goods, which is very important. So I'm going to call that net flow net gov, which can go either direction, but under the austerity being pushed by the Troika, the flow is going to be from the private sector to the government sector. And the negative on one side is a positive on the other. This is the sectoral balances approach that modern monetary theory has made a lot of, and importantly so. So that means there has to be this sustained flow of money from the private sector to the government, equivalent to 4.5% of GDP. So, how does the private sector get that money? You can't just simply go out and print the stuff yourself, can you? Okay? You can make goods and services yourself, that's not illegal. But if you want to actually give money to the government, you've got to produce dollar notes or pound notes or euro, whatever the taxes are denominated in. So you've got to get it out of your own cash reserves. Now, one-off, that's not a problem. There's two ways you can do that. The public either has to reduce its savings or go into debt to the private banking sector. Now, that's the opposite of what people who argue for a surplus believe. They think the government running a surplus will make it easier for the private sector to run a surplus. But in monetary terms, for the government to run a surplus, its impact upon the private sector has to be to take money out of it. Now, how do you actually get that money? Well, you've either got to reduce your bank balances or you've got to borrow from the banks. So you now have to break private sector into two halves, the banks and the non-banks. And for the private sector, non-bank kind of part of the economy to pay what the government wants, the banks have to, inverted commas, run a deficit, meaning that the repayments that they take back from the public and the interest they get from the public has to be less than the new loans. So the flow of new debt to the private sector has to be a flow of positive flow from the banks to the household sector. So you can say the private, in that sense, I can say that the private banks are running a deficit. Loans are greater than repayments. Okay? So that gives you a flow from there. And if it's exactly the same as the surplus the government's trying to run, then you can get a balance in the private sector, so no change in the private sector's money, but a flow of money from the banking sector through the private sector to the government, which of course is making the private sector more indebted to the banks. Now if you're running at 4.5% of GDP, and if I have a constant amount of money there, the GDP is not likely to rise. Okay? Because there's very rarely been an economy that has grown in real terms without also growing in monetary terms. But that's exactly what the Troika is trying to impose on Greece. They're trying to make them to grow in monetary terms or else having a shrinking amount of money. Interesting problem. So in this particular instance here, I've got the public money stock remaining constant. So the only way the economy could grow in that situation would be if the velocity of money was rising. There's only one problem with that, it doesn't. This is looking at the American data for what they call money of zero maturity. And it rose from 1960 to 1980 from about under 2 to about 3.5. So the money turning over less than twice a year to more than 3.5 times a year. But it's been downhill ever since. On a rate of turnover of that money now is down to about 1.4. And it's trending down, and it goes down during recessions. It doesn't go up. So you're not going to get increased economic activity out of money turning over more rapidly as the government takes money off the private sector. So you're going to at best get no economic growth, or maybe even a contraction, but also, of course, a rising level of private debt to GDP. Constant GDP, increasing debt, you've got a rising debt ratio. So that the objective of running a government surplus, if you sustain it for long enough, is going to give you a financial crisis. Because the public's borrowing enough money to pay what the government wants, it's borrowing it off the banks, the economy is not growing in this particular instance I'm looking at here. So what you're going to have is an increasing level of private debt. And the same thing applies when you say, well, let's imagine now we're borrowing enough money to increase the money supply as that the private sector has, as well as pay the surplus. So I've got the government getting a surplus out of this, the deficit from the banks enabling the private sector's money supply to grow, and the economy growing as well. But in that situation, you've still got the level of debt growing faster than GDP. Okay. And growing faster than when I had no growth going on as well. So at some point, you're going to have a level of private debt to GDP that's so high, the private sector can't imagine borrowing any more money. And when it stops borrowing money, you're going to have a financial crisis. Now, I'm not seeing a causal link as going from the government running a surplus to the private sector, by the way. This is just simply accounting. What tends to happen instead is the private sector gets caught up in a bubble, like the subprime bubble or the dot-com before that, borrows huge amounts of money to finance the bubble, and the extra economic activity means government tax revenues rise and welfare payments drop, and the government runs a surplus. So the causal thing is really from the behaviour of the private sector, but the accounting holds. So if you actually run a surplus successfully for some substantial period of time, you're going to have a financial crisis, which is crazy because we're trying to secure the fact that we actually got into one. So what actually happens when you get to this point where the private sector's got too much debt to cope with, it then stops increasing its debt level, it starts to delever. And that's exactly what's happening in Greece. Now this is the data you never get a look at because the conventional discussion ignores the role of private debt and just focuses upon government debt. But this is the red line is the annual change in private debt in Greece compared to GDP, graphed on the left-hand side. And the blue line is the unemployment rate. notice there's a certain correlation between the two. It's more than correlation, there's a causal relationship going on there. But you can see that the rate of growth of private debt peaked at almost 20% of GDP in 2008. It's been downhill ever since. Unemployment was falling. The unemployment's graphed upside down again to make the correlation more obvious. It's been plunging ever since. So because the government sector is trying to run a surplus, the private sector is also trying to get out of debt, and the whole economy is shrinking. So austerity is having the exact opposite impact that it's supposed to have, because of course it's a theory of a planet that doesn't exist in a solar system we haven't discovered yet, and a universe that isn't there. That's neoclassical economics when it comes to looking at money. So we've got a contracting economy now in Greece, courtesy of falling money supply and falling velocity as well. And this is the situation they're in. Looking at roughly in terms of how fast they're deleveraging right now, the rate of reduction of private debt's about 8% of GDP per annum. The surplus they're running is about 1.5% of GDP, and they're trying to, part of what Varoufakis is arguing for is not to go beyond 1.5%. The Troika actually wants it to be 4.5%. The only positive contribution is coming in from exports, where they're making about a 1% surplus right now. But the economy has to contract in monetary terms under all those pressures, and maintaining the austerity will maintain that contraction. So it's insane to try to have a surplus over a sustained period of time, and equally a balanced budget is also fairly silly, because you're still going to have, given a balanced budget with a growing money supply, you're going to have a growing level of private indebtedness. So the whole idea that you should run a balanced budget as a point of reference assumes an equilibrium system that's not growing over time. We live in a non-equilibrium system that is growing over time. You need more money in that system. There are two ways to create it: the private sector and the government, the private sector banks and the government. And so the sustainable situation, not perfectly sustainable either, but better than what we're trying to do right now, is that both the government and the banks, looking at their accounts in a way that I can use the term sensibly, should both be running a deficit. They then provide the money that the private sector uses for economic activity. So the reference point for a sensible government should be running a small deficit, something roughly equivalent to the rate of the deficit, roughly the same size as the rate of growth of the economy. And that, of course, in the external sector, one country's export surplus is another deficit. In the aggregate, that has to be zero overall. So the desirable situation is the same for each country. Now, of course, that's completely the opposite of the conclusion that Barrow reached. But Barrow reached that conclusion by ignoring money, ignoring disequilibrium, and believing we can predict the future. Interesting planet, not the one we live on. So it comes down to this whole issue of a major focus that I've made since I read Debunking Economics is taking a look at how money is included in the way economists think. And some of you may have seen a little battle with Paul Krugman. Anybody? Okay. Krugman, of course, is probably the most eloquent representative of the mainstream in the sense that he writes so clearly you can't mistake what he's saying. A lot of the neoclassicals, you read it and you really wonder, you wonder what you need to take to be able to understand what they said. But what Krugman did in a paper with Egerton is build a model of loanable funds, which was talking about lending being a case of one person lending to another person. So the lender's spending power goes down, the borrower's spending power goes up, and effectively the two cancel out. And they had a model of a bank and the appendix to that paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. So what I did was use my software package Minsky, which is an open source program, by the way. You can all, if you want to take a look, you can download it and check it out yourself. And what I've done is build a banking sector modelled in the way that Krugman and Egerton spoke about the banking sector there, where the consumer sector lends to the investment sector. And the banking sector then has arranged the loan, so the banking sector's only source of revenue is charging a fee for intermediating between between the consumer sector and the investment sector. And then I have them both hiring workers, producing output, selling it to workers and bankers, etc., etc. And it's a dynamic model. So if I simulate this, I can get a level of economic growth coming out there pretty close to zero, as you can see. It will finally stabilise at zero economic growth because there's no change in the money supply. The only way you can get growth is by change in velocity. And if I increase the rate of lending, which I can do that way, I get a bit of a fall in the growth level, then it's back to zero again, or drastically slow down lending, a bit of an improvement in the economy, back down again, and do the same same sort of changes to the rates of lending, so make lending happen much more slowly, or repayment rather much more slowly, and then much more rapidly. I've now been running the simulation for 30 years or so and simulated time there, and you can see GDP has bounced around a bit because there have been changes in velocity courtesy of me shifting money between those sectors. But overall, no change in the economy, which means from their point of view, banks' debt and money are irrelevant. Okay? They're second-order effects, and this is the way that Bernanke argued you could ignore Irving Fisher's debt deflation theory of Great Depressions. But what they've got going on, as I show here, is lending between the consumer sector and the investment sector, not banks lending money, because they say it doesn't matter. Well, I'm going to check that out, because this is currently showing the debt as an asset of the consumer sector. Well, okay, maybe there's some minor part of lending which is peer-to-peer, so to speak. Most of it is from banks. So I'm going to just delete that and say, well, the debt's not an asset of the consumer sector, and the lending and all that sort of jazz isn't really going between the consumer sector and the investment sector. It's actually the bank that has that asset. So I'm just going to now whack the bank as an asset over here. This is using some of the capabilities in Minsky to do this rapidly, and say the interest payments are actually made to the bank, and the bank fees are relevant, and the amount of lending is not actually based on what's in the consumer sector's account, but it's actually based on the amount of debt. If I grab the right one there, didn't want to make it into a slider. Never do these demos live. I could have stuffed it up. We'll soon see. Let's see. So let's reprogram the system. Go back and start again. Have I done it properly? Yes, I have, and I just haven't changed the values here. So notice, if I now slow down the rate of relending, the rate of growth of the economy increases. If I increase the rate of lending, the economy grows further. If I now slow down the rate of lending, growth rate goes down. If repayment is done more rapidly, it falls further. Notice what's happening to GDP down here. I'll go back up a bit again, changing those values. But I've had a boom and then a slump in the economy by changing the rate of growth of the money, rate of growth of debt. That's the real world we live in. It's incredibly simple to build a model like this and just show that the reason bank lending matters is because bank lending creates money, and when that money is created, it creates both demand and income at the same time. You borrow the money, you spend it on somebody else. So the change in debt, because it's also the change in money, is the major factor driving the economy. And what neoclassical economists are doing by ignoring that is ignoring the major factor that causes both change in the economy and financial crises. So it's no wonder they didn't see the crisis coming. So that's the sort of thing that I'm doing in terms of monetary modelling. But that's also a non-cyclical model, just because it's working in I don't actually have any non-linearities in the model there. So I'm going to show you the one that I built, which gave me an inkling as to where the financial crisis is going to come from before it happened, which was based on Richard Goodwin's cyclical model of the economy. It's a very, very simple model. It says that capital, the amount of machinery and factories you have, roughly speaking, determines your output level. Output, roughly speaking, that you choose to produce, tells you how many workers you need to hire to produce it. The employment rate then determines the rate of change of wages, the classic Phillips curve type argument. Wages determine profits, profit determines investment, and investment's the rate of change of capital. Now that is actually a cyclical model. So I'm putting it together in the simplest possible way, which Goodwin did. You can say there's a rough ratio, just using a constant there, between capital and output, another constant for labour productivity between output and employment. You then have employment divided by population as the employment rate. A simple linear Phillips curve there. I don't believe it's linear, but just for the sake of illustration. The rate of change of wages then being determined by that Phillips curve relationship. Wages times the labour employment level gives you the wage bill. Subtract that from output, you get profit. In the simple model, the Goodwin did, all profit is invested. Investment minus depreciation is the rate of change of the capital stock, and you've got a cyclical model. So I'll just put that together very quickly in Minsky with a few simple values and initial values for the parameters. Having done all that, you then get a model that behaves like that. So I'll just bring this up. That's an incredibly simple model. What it gives you is not equilibrium, but permanent cycles in employment and wages share. It's hardly complicated to build it, okay? But that's the cyclical vision. That's an essential part of thinking in a non-neoclassical way. Now, what I added to that was a bit of realism, because capitalists don't invest all their profits. They invest more during booms and less during slumps. And of course, I can bring that in very simply by saying let's have a linear investment function here as well as a linear Phillips curve argument. And that's the rate of profit now determining the level of investment. And I'm ignoring at the moment where they get the money from, just seeing what happens when I bring in this extra element of realism, but not taking a look at the banking sector now. So I bring that in, put that into the model, and you get exactly the same sort of look to the cycles. I won't bother running a simulation. You can see the shape is the same. But a bit more realism again. When capitalists borrow money, they borrow it from banks. So desired investment, if it's greater than profit, increases debt. And banks, of course, charge interest on that. So that's the very simple model I did back in my PhD. So I had to add in a rate of profit now, of debt being the rate of change of debt being investment minus profits. And this, just using the same linear curve I've used a moment ago, what I get now is this sort of model. And just to simulate that, one thing I'm doing deliberately in this model is using simply linear relationships, because I've given these presentations before to a bunch of neoclassicals, and when thinking in particular, I gave it to I presented this model rather to the New Zealand Central Bank, and a very rabid young neoclassical managed to stymie them providing money to continue developing Minsky. And he argued, it's just because you've got exponential relationships in your model that you get the results you're showing. Pardon me, but technically speaking, its technical term for that is bullshit, because these are totally linear models here, and you run the same system, and the type of behaviour I'm showing you there, I better go through it again because it's rather too fast a simulation. What you get, first of all, looks like the cycles are diminishing. But then after a while, they start to rise again. And notice it's over here with a rising level of debt to GDP that those cycles get more extreme. Now, the exponential relations in a nonlinear model are used not to generate the cyclical effects. They're structural. They come out of the fact of multiplying one variable by another, wages times the labour level of employment. The nonlinear functions you put in give you more realism. So if I replace that with genuine more realistic functions, I still have the same characteristics. Declining volatility for a while. Now, that was not a prediction of Minsky's verbal model. That's something that came out of this mathematical model. Then rising volatility and breakdown, along with a rising level of debt to GDP, and also declining workers' share of output, which means rising inequality. So all those effects come out of this very, very simple model. And having this in the back of my mind is why when I saw the data in 2005 and I focused on the debt to GDP ratio, I thought a crisis has to be coming. Somebody has to warn about it. So what I also added in that model, I don't often talk about this, but it's, again, I've had people saying that it's unrealistic outcomes, nothing like that actually happened in the real world. When I add a government sector to the model, I have the government spending based on the level of employment. So a high level of unemployment means a high level of the rate of growth of government spending. And by bringing this idea into the model, with a range of what look like fairly complex functions, but they're just generalised exponential functions, putting that into the model, I get cyclical behaviour, which also isn't how the world operates. It fits between the two models I'm showing here. Let's just move in so you can see more of the simulation there. But you get complex cycles which repeat indefinitely. Again, you don't have to reach equilibrium. The whole idea that everything's happened in equilibrium is one of the great misnomers in neoclassical thinking from the 19th century mindset. So, of course, the real world is neither one extreme that I showed you beforehand nor that one. It fits between the two. And I argued this in my 1995 paper as well, that the governments have become more tolerant of high unemployment over time. So they've let the so-called natural rate, they've been willing to let that rise from what they thought was 4% in America to 6 and 7%, those sorts of levels. They've tolerated that increase in unemployment, but they've continued rescuing during downturns. So my expectation was to see us hitting further and further towards deflation with having rising levels of private debt, which is what's happened. And then what happens in the aftermath is public debt rises to compensate. And it certainly has compensated for this crisis in America, but of course when you don't let it happen, you see what happens in Greece. Now, one important reason why we're seeing a deflationary surge right now is the sheer level of private debt. And unfortunately, this economic data is very poorly collected. Unemployment is redefined every 5 or 10 years to make it look smaller than it was last time. Private debt has been defined numerous ways over time, but when I try to put together using current definitions of private debt and government debt, that's the data I get for America for the last 180 years. The blue line being government debt, the one that all the neoclassicals obsess about, as if that's the major problem. The red line, which I think is the major problem, the level of private debt, and the black being the aggregate. And there's something wrong with our society when this scale of debt, both private and public, is an essential part of running it. We're doing something wrong. Not just what's happening with private debt, but also what's happening with public debt. So I think a major part of getting out of this crisis is realising we can't let debt grow like it's happened here. We have to write it off in the same sense that ancient societies used to do through jubilees. We simply have to realise that capitalism can't function with debt levels that high. So that's a bit of a quick overview. There's much more to what a post-Keynesian economics than I've mentioned here. And of course the other schools of thought as well is something we're teaching at Kingston as best we can. We expand our staff and expand our master's program. But in general, given the failure of the neoclassical paradigm, it's time for pluralism to rule. And I really do appreciate the students' movement choosing pluralism. This has come completely out of the student groups. That's not saying they want a complete overthrow. They're saying they want to hear everything, all the various schools of thought. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, when I was doing similar stuff to what you guys are doing now, a lot of the students were straight-out Marxist. They're arguing for Marxian explanations and seeing socialism coming along, and they could be, to some extent, properly typecast as revolutionaries and anti-capitalist. That's not possible due to the current movement. It's simply saying we want to understand the system we're in well. Nobody's expecting socialism. Nobody's calling for the overthrow of capitalism. You're saying we want to understand the system, not overthrow it. So I think that's fantastic. I really do applaud the student movement for taking that approach. And we should be teaching everything and let a new realistic paradigm evolve over time with you people being the ones who design it. And of course, if your university doesn't give you what you want on that front, then why don't you come down the road to Kingston? Thank you.